I'm going to talk through how you answer the 5-mark Norman interpretation question. This is the one that I feel is the one that students often get quite confused by and a little bit scared by. But the thing I would say about this is, one, it's a lot simpler than you think, and two, it's only 5 marks. So it's not a vast amount of marks, so it doesn't even matter if you make a little mistake on it. But I'm going to talk through how you can avoid those mistakes and do it brilliantly. 5-mark question always goes hand in hand with the 3-mark question, and they're always based on one interpretation. But the 5-mark bit, this bit, is always a little bit different, because what it's asking you to do is basically suggest further research. So the question is always phrased in this way. If you were asked to do further research on one aspect of interpretation A, what would you choose to investigate? Explain how this would help us to understand X. And X here would be an event. So it could be explain how this would help us to understand Battle of Hastings, or Hereward the Wake, or the Domesday Book, or Anglo-Saxon society. So the thing that you need to focus on here is further research on one aspect. And essentially what we need to do is think like a historian. And if we think like a historian, we really get to that thing that we've talked about in previous lessons of second-order concepts. And second-order concepts are a fancy way for thinking like a historian. And we can group those things that historians think about quite easily into 3 groups. Firstly, you could think about change in continuity. How much things have changed over time, or how little things have changed over time, how much they've stayed the same, continuity. Or you could think about similarity and difference. How similar was that experience for all groups of people? Was it very different for women? Was it very different for lower classes? Was it very different or very similar for upper classes? So similarity and differences, diversity of experience. And the last thing you could look at is cause and consequence. Why do things happen and what happened next? And if I'm really honest with you, with this question, this 5-marker, I would not veer away from these 3 things. So when it's asking you to do further research on one aspect, I would always think, what might this help me think about change in continuity, similarity and difference, cause and consequence? And which one of those 3 would I want to look at when I was looking for doing further research? Now, this is all a bit abstract, so I thought we would talk through 3 questions and I would explain to you what I mean in that. This question, though, is really simple to answer. And it's simple to answer because, as I said, it's only 5 marks. So these sentence starters here will help you, because 5 marks, I wouldn't bother doing any more than about 1/3 to 1/2 a page at most. And I would start with phrases like this. If I were asked to do further research on interpretation A, I would choose to look at. This would be interesting because it would reveal. This would be important because 1 paragraph, simple sentence starters. Let's look at some examples to understand what I mean. Here is the first example question we're going to look through. And I'm not going to read the interpretation because I don't think you need it to understand the second half. But this interpretation is from the historian Robert Bartlett, and he's arguing about how the Harrying of the North had a very powerful impact on Northern England. If you wanted to, you could stop the video now, read through that interpretation. But I'm really interested in the second half, the 5-mark question at the bottom. If you were asked to do further research on one aspect of interpretation A, what would you choose to investigate? Explain how this would help us to analyse and understand the Harrying of the North. Okay, that's simple if we think about those 3 groups again. So what I could do is I could choose to look at change in continuity. So I could look at how much the situation had changed 20, 30, 50 years later. So I could look at the Harrying of the North and think about how much things had changed over time. Or I could look at similarity and difference. So another aspect of further research is I could look at the question, was this the same experience for all levels of society? Was it the same for the Ceorls or the slaves of Anglo-Saxon England? Was it the same for women? I could easily look at that by looking at different parish records, and it would be really interesting. Or I could look at the change in consequence. What were the causes of that event? So one further aspect that I would like to look at in terms of the harrowing of the North are the precise causes. I'd like to look at the long-term causes and the short-term causes of this event. 3 things. I'd choose one of them. Really simple. Look at a second example. In this example, interpretation A is about Norman castles, and it's an illustration of a castle in Newcastle. And again, I'm not interested in the first half, I'm interested in that 5-mark question at the end. If I was asked to do further research, what would I choose to investigate? Really simple. Let's go back to those 3 groups again. I could look at change in continuity. I would like to look at how castles changed over time. I would do this by looking at the archaeological remains of different castles in different places in the country to see how they changed. Or I could look at similarity and difference. I'd like to look at whether castles were the same across the country. This picture of a castle in Newcastle, was that the same as castles in Bristol, in York, in London, in Wales? That would be really interesting. Or I could look at change in consequence. What were the consequences of the castles for the people in the region? This castle's in Newcastle. I'd like to look at what people thought about this castle. Were they scared? Were they happy? Were they terrified? 3 things, 1 interpretation. I would only choose one of those. Let's look at a third example. In this example, it's an interpretation about Norman rule was harsh. And it's a scene from a BBC film where William looks really, really angry and he's just been presented with the Domesday Book. Again, I'm not interested in the 3-mark, I'm interested in the 5-mark. If I was asked to do further research on one aspect of interpretation A, what would I choose to investigate? Really simple. Let's go through those 3 things again. Change in continuity. I'd like to look at whether there was a later version of the Domesday Book. I know the Domesday Book was published in the 1080s. I'd like to look at 100 years on. How did those tax records change? Do they show the same people who were owning the land then? Do they show that they were owning the same amount of land? Do they show that they're owning the same types of property? Change in continuity. Or I could look at similarity and difference. I'd like to look at whether the Domesday Book shows that wealth was spread across the country equally or not. Was it that the south was richer than the north? The east was richer than the west? I'd like to look at why. Or I could look at change in continuity and consequence. What were the consequences of this event? What happened in the next few years? Were people scared that they were going to be taxed higher? Were people quite happy about this event? I'd like to look at the consequences. Really simple. So, back to some top tips. If you were asked to do further research on one aspect of interpretation A, what would you choose to investigate? Firstly, keep it simple. Focus on one thing, 1 second order concept, either change in continuity or similarity and difference or cause and consequence. Secondly, explain why it would be interesting. This would be interesting because. Third, if you can, suggest how you would do that research. Would you look at archaeological remains? Would you look at primary sources from the time? Would you look at what other historians have thought about it? Lastly, if you can, bring in some own knowledge. If it's relevant. Do those things, keep it simple, keep it to half a page. That 5-marker is actually dead good and dead easy to do. Good luck.